My name is Ruth Samara, and I am the acting administrative director and the executive director of the Northeast Ohio Medical University Coordinating Centers of Excellence in the Department of Psychiatry. And I want to thank you for joining us today, both here in person on the NeoMed campus and virtually those who are online for this very special event. So welcome to the 8th annual Drs. Fred and Penny Frese Lecture on behalf of PEGS Foundation and the NeoMed Department of Psychiatry. This lecture series began in 2018 as a powerful platform for storytelling, education, and hope. And each year highlights the adversity, triumphs, and challenges faced by individuals living with serious mental illness, and most importantly, the many pathways to recovery. Every lecturer shares their own lived experience perspective, offering insight into the treatments, support, and turning points that shaped their journey. Together, they advocate for better coordinated specialty care, greater compassion, and continued innovation in mental health medicine. Dr. Fred Frese believed that people can live a meaningful life and manage their illness when given the right access to treatment and support. In Fred Frese's own words, and this is a quote, "My purpose or cause is to assist individuals who are in recovery from these serious mental illnesses to be able to reintegrate back into society and not be ashamed of their disorders." NeoMed Department of Psychiatry and PEGS Foundation share Dr. Fred Frese's vision, and the department aspires to be a national model for disseminating a continuum of integrated treatment services that promote recovery and improve the lives of individuals with schizophrenia and other serious mental illnesses. For those of you who are not familiar, the NeoMed Department of Psychiatry includes 3 coordinating centers of excellence, all of which work with multiple partners to disseminate best mental health treatment practices in community-based settings. The Ohio Criminal Justice Coordinating Center of Excellence encourages Ohio communities to forge collaborations between the behavioral health, criminal, legal, and other community-based service systems that help each community develop effective programs that engage people with mental health and substance use disorders with a health-facing response to divert or deflect them from criminal legal involvement when that's possible. The Ohio Program for Campus Safety and Mental Health promotes a comprehensive approach to mental health awareness, stigma reduction, suicide prevention, campus safety, and academic success at Ohio colleges and universities. The Best Practices in Schizophrenia Treatment, or BEST Center, provides expert training, consultation, and program evaluation, advocacy, and public education to accelerate the use and dissemination of evidence-based and promising practices for schizophrenia treatment and recovery. These centers of excellence do this work in collaboration with people with lived experience of serious mental illnesses, their friends and families, PEGS Foundation, the Ohio Department of Behavioral Health, NAMI Ohio and their affiliates, the Office of Criminal Justice Services, and numerous other funding partners, plus an enormous number of cross-system partners locally, statewide, and nationally. We are pleased to introduce at this point Mr. Rick Keller, President and CEO of PEGS Foundation, who's going to kick us off.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Ruth. PEGS Foundation, NeoMed, Coordinating Centers of Excellence, partnered to bring this lecture series together back in 2018, but I would honestly argue that it was really the vision of Dr. Mark Munitz, who was the inaugural chair of psychiatry here, that we endowed. One of the first things I did when I came to the foundation, so thank you, Mark, for honoring Fred and Penny in the way that you did. And I also want to welcome special guests that are here today, Fred's wife, Penny, and Fred's daughter, Bridget. You can just raise your hand. All right, thanks. We're pleased to have you here. Dr. Penny and Fred were married for over 40 years. They were partners in marriage, raising a family, and advocating for people with mental illness. Stories from people like Drs. Frese, Ellen Sachs, Brandon Staglin, and others are past Frese lecturers, and they demonstrate how folks living with schizophrenia or other serious mental illnesses can function, can recover, and should be accepted by all elements of the community, particularly the academic community, and that we believe that recovery is the expectation, not the exception. Fred was sought after as a speaker. He delivered the message over 2,000 times all over the world. One of the most raucous ones was at the RNC here in Cleveland back in, I think, 2016, which was a super fun moment to be with him at that one. And his speeches often gave the audience a message that I have schizophrenia, and I absolutely refuse to be ashamed. I absolutely refuse to hide in the shadows and pretend that I'm not somebody that I am. I want things to change. That's with an exclamation point and a fist in the air, I'm sure. We're here at NeoMed where Fred taught many medical students about lived experience and the ability to recover from those serious illnesses. And it helped shape with the Department of Psychiatry how this institution produces physicians that understand serious mental illness and psychiatry in ways that a lot of medical universities are not able to do. It's a great legacy of Fred. Fred changed the landscape of mental illness. He influenced changes through education, advocating, and living by example. He testified before the U.S. Congress, at the State House here in Ohio, spoke on many TV and radio broadcasts, and was a prosumer mental health clinician with a personal lived experience of mental illness. And one of the coolest things that I think about Fred is as he would be on CNN or testify at Congress in the Capitol, a week later, he would be downtown in Akron at Community Support Services with a group of fellow prosumers sitting shoulder to shoulder with them, folks that were homeless or unhoused at that time. So he did both. Like he was a famous person, but he never forgot the journey of others around him. And we're always grateful for that. And I'm mostly grateful that PEG's foundation is based in Hudson, Ohio, and Penny and Fred lived down the street. And who knew that the providence of God would put us in a position where we could have this iconic person in a place that could help nurture us as a foundation and shape how we think about folks that we serve. And I don't know that I mentioned this, but PEG is nicknamed for Margaret Clark Morgan, Peg Morgan, PEG's foundation. Her son has schizophrenia, and the relationship between Penny, Fred, and Peg and Bert was super important in their journey in getting Dave into recovery as well. I want to, when you leave, or if you didn't notice on the way in, there's some displays in the back that talk about the coordinating centers of excellence here at NeoMed that do great work to activate smart, I'll say policy, but activities across our state, things like crisis intervention, team training, first episode work, and coordinated specialty care. You'll also see another partner of both NeoMed and PEGS is the University of Akron Archives for the History of Psychology. I know Nev was there yesterday. There's a display, and it's really cool. I think there's a picture of Fred back there smiling ear to ear. I think he's maybe 6 or 7 years old, but there's some of his archival things that were donated by Penny to the archives as well. And there's a book collection also that Penny had donated to the university here, and there's some samples of that back there as well. And we're excited. Like, this is like what's cool. The legacy of Fred is this idea that you have a variety of universities, a variety of disciplines, psychology and psychiatry, and also community-based care that are coming together in a way that's super meaningful. And I know Fred and Peg would be excited to be here today if they could. And we miss them both dearly. Now, I'd like to introduce today's Dr. Fred and Penny Frese Lecturer, Nev Jones. Nev is an associate professor and mental health services researcher at the University of Pittsburgh in the School of Social Work. Nev, just like Fred, is an accomplished psychologist. She's also, just like Fred, a prosumer and an advocate for changing the landscape. Nev actually knew Fred. They attended many of the same conferences and received an invite to visit the NeoMed campus and meet with Fred and others in the department several years ago. So this is not her first time here. Second time here. Her research encompasses sociocultural determinants of mental health, psychosis-focused services, community psychologist, health equity, and disability justice. She's strongly invested in increasing peer service and user involvement and leadership in research and policy and is tackling health-related structural inequalities. Her areas of expertise include early intervention in psychosis and coordinated specialty care, quality improvement and technology transfer within public sector community health services, the impacts of race, class, income, and community context on the trajectories of folks that have these illnesses. Zip code shouldn't matter when you seek treatment if you're mentally ill. Unfortunately, in our area and in our country, it does. The centering of mental health services, user perspectives on intervention and system design, as well as quality improvement and crisis response systems, and the role and impact of police involvement, coercion, and involuntary interventions, especially in the context of initial youth, young adult pathways into and through care. Without further ado, Nev Jones.
Okay. Thank you, Rick. And I really want to thank everybody over the last 2 days who I've met with who has been so incredibly warm and welcoming and forgiving of various things that I've been late to. When Lucky first reached out to me, she actually didn't know of my history with Fred. And so before I dive into my presentation, I just want to talk a little bit about Fred. So Lucky then asked, oh, when did you first meet Fred? And I think my initial response was so long ago, I'm going to have to reconstruct when, which I then did. So when I was first diagnosed with schizophrenia, and actually not immediately, but in the ensuing years, as my sort of hopes for the future went down and down and down, one thing I would argue with my therapist at the time about was whether it was possible for somebody with schizophrenia to get a Ph.D. So I had been in a Ph.D. program. I was kicked out. I was terminated from my program post-diagnosis, and I was just in an incredibly dark place. And at the time, you actually could not Google and find people with PhDs with an open schizophrenia diagnosis, at least in the US. There were a few internationally. And then Fred and a few colleagues actually published a paper in Schizophrenia Bulletin around 2006 that I think was titled Professionals with a Diagnosis of Schizophrenia. And I was absolutely no one at the time. I'm not even sure I had even restarted graduate school yet. And I sent him an email and he immediately responded. And this was such classic Fred. The most incredible kindness from the start. And you would never know or never have realized, I think, as Rick was just saying, how, in fact, famous and distinguished and accomplished he was, because that was not how he presented himself. It was always kindness. He would send me random emails because then we got to know each other a lot better as the years went on. He would find something he thought I would be interested in, and he would just send me a kind little random email to tell me about something. I think like the kindness and the humility of Fred is just a singularly rare virtue in people. One almost never comes across it. I think it's something that I can only aspire to emulate. A lot of our conversations over the years were related to navigating the very difficult and fraught space of lived experience. There is a lot of tension and disagreement between advocates and activists. I think sometimes you wouldn't even be aware of it if you're not, so to speak, in the hot seat. And you're often judged much more harshly as a person with lived experience by other activists and advocates, because if you don't agree with certain positions, that's seen as betrayal in a different way. And Fred was just incredibly kind in the way that he would often explain other people to me, like, understand where they're coming from or why they might be feeling or reacting that way or have made those decisions. And that was honestly a lot of what our correspondence over the years was about. And it was always from a place of just absolute humility and non-judgment of others. It was just trying to explain people's responses and reactions in a way that just brought everybody together. But I've also absolutely seen the worst of the system over and over and over. And one kind of theme of this presentation is taking seriously those most impacted by SMI and associated services. And I don't put myself into that category. I think I have had an awful lot of luck and privilege as I've navigated this space. The level of disability different people face is radically different. And what above all keeps me honest is actually that constant exposure to really significant long-term disability, to long-term unemployment, to what it is like to live off of SSI and the constraints of SSI. So I think those firsthand experiences always bring me back to people who are not served, still not served by current systems. All right, so without further ado then, I will dive in. I do want to say, when I say critical things about the state of things, I am not coming from a place of sort of bench armchair critique, right? I think we need to call out the problems because otherwise we're not going to change them. I was really delighted, probably only a small subset of us were at the foundation offices, and there's a clip of Fred from 2016. And actually, I've never seen a clip of Fred where he was sort of quite that animated and fierce, ferocious in kind of laying down policy points. And I was like, wow, these are my talking points, right? Reduce 25 years mortality, more people now in prisons, jails, and on the streets or in shelters than the number of psychiatric beds, right? Like, things are bad and we have to face that or we're not going to change it. So for those of you who have not seen this clip of Fred, it's really powerful. Okay, so I'm gonna dive in now. This is a very kind of SMI focused talk, and I will explain why. I have a lot of concerns that in the last 10 years, SMI has been pushed more and more and more to the margins of public discourse and policy regarding mental health. And to the extent that it gets attention, it's normally around some form of NIMBYism. In New York City, you see this around, we don't want people in the subways. They're making the commute dangerous or inconvenient, or they're leaving, they're leaving garbage around. You see it in encampments in the city of San Francisco, right? We don't have a clear path to walk down our sidewalk because homeless people are sleeping on the streets. So that gets a lot of attention, but the genuine motivation of taking a group that has been incredibly marginalized historically and through to the present day, and from a heartfelt place, wanting to ensure that people are true integrated members of the community with opportunities to flourish, that is not the motivation that we see dominating policy spaces right now, and that's deeply concerning. All right, so some of the problems. So part of my kind of analysis, right, of what has happened over the years is that lived experience has expanded and expanded and expanded to the point that it almost has no meaning anymore. Since the pandemic, and for very good reasons, right? There has been a huge focus on youth mental health. There has been endless articles, newspaper, special issues of magazines written on the quote unquote youth mental health crisis or the campus or college student crisis of mental health. And I do not in any way want to say that any of that is illegitimate. These are mental health challenges stemming predominantly from societal circumstances in the sense of isolation during COVID. These are real things. These are real phenomenon, but they are not the same thing as, for example, a young person struggling with psychosis or a schizophrenia diagnosis. And so what has happened over the years is that in the wake of deinstitutionalization, there was a clear population or community, individuals who had initially met criteria, right, to be institutionalized. And even on the activist side, that's who the activists were, right? They were overwhelmingly, in fact, I cannot think of a single exception, people who had been institutionalized in state hospitals, experienced what it's like to be in the particular kinds of power relationships that you end up in, right? When you are the recipient of very, very kind of stigmatized labels, diagnoses, kind of identity markers. So it was clear, and in a way, what was being fought for was clear, right? People's right to lead meaningful lives in the community was the crux, right, of the recovery movement. Over the decades, we have grown, you're kind of drifted further and further from that. We now generically use the term mental health challenges often, ostensibly from a place of wanting to kind of destigmatize and use softer language. But what it often does is it levels the experience of people with very, very significant levels of disability who are by no means welcomed into civic spaces or the community, and it equates that with the everyday struggles that everyone has. And it has also really, I think, diffused then what we're even talking about when we say we need lived experience in the room, what we're even talking about when we say mental health reform. It's not clear, and it's now such an expansive, huge population continuum of services that it's really hard to maintain focus. A prevention frame has really, I think, displaced what in the wake of deinstitutionalization was originally a strong focus on sort of rehabilitation and recovery-oriented services for people with long-term psychiatric disabilities, right? It was, how do you take someone who has maybe even been in an institution for 15 years and really kind of restore their pathways into meaningful kind of civic life and involvement and employment? And that rehabilitative focus was absolutely central. And I actually think we have really lost that. In its place, the much more kind of feel-good focus on prevention has really taken hold. And I think in most philanthropy, that's absolutely clear, right? The amount of funding for youth prevention or early intervention is enormous compared to the amount of money that the philanthropic center in general, right, across the country. And so you have this sort of general prevention first, and then, and this is a space I'm very familiar with and have done a lot of work in, right? The first episode, psychosis, and then one step back, clinical high-risk space, have kind of ended up centered in a way that really has ended up ultimately diverting a lot of resources, funding, and just attention from folks with what sometimes gets referred to as multi-episode psychosis, or long-term. Not one episode that resolves, somebody gets back to a happy life. That's wonderful when that happens, but there are a lot of people for whom that is not the experience, that's not the trajectory. But these are feel good from a policy perspective. Even if it isn't true, the claim is often, oh, well, we're preventing the long-term chronic thing. There's actually no evidence that we have ever achieved that with psychosis, but it makes policymakers feel better, and it actually functions as an alibi for disinvestment, because it is actually cheaper if you are kind of putting forward a funding agenda or platform that puts what seems like a bunch of money, but just for 2 years into this population versus what it actually takes to sustainably fund services across the entire lifespan, which is in fact what we need. And this is a real concern of mine, that these trends have actually gotten worse over the last 20 years, not better. Stigma is one area where we have population level data from Bernice Pescosolito's team that stigma towards schizophrenia has deteriorated, gotten worse decade on decade. That is not true for depression. That is not true for what are sometimes referred to as common mental disorders. Everybody's familiar with sort of mental health TikTok, I assume. So a lot of youth are talking about ADHD, autism, depression, anxiety. People are not talking about schizophrenia in the same way. And there have been really, really significant increases specifically in the sort of coupling of schizophrenia with perceived dangerousness, really kind of major increases among the general public. Declining annual rates of recovery and worsening outcomes for multi-episode psychosis. And I'll just walk over to read this quote. So this is a really, really major study that came out in 2021. And the attempt was to take the exact same recovery criteria that have been now used for 40 years and estimate across both globally and specifically in kind of high-income countries, because that's where most of the data comes from, what rates of recovery and outcomes actually look like. And again, we sometimes hear these narratives of progress that don't map onto reality. So let me just read some of the results of their review and kind of meta-analysis of this data. While we have found that rates of complete recovery have increased substantially for people experiencing a first episode of psychosis, not all of our findings are positive. Findings by both Warner and Jaskalainen showed decreasing annualized rates of recovery over time, and we have found a continuing decline in annual rates of recovery since Warner's review. Differences in method and criteria can account for some differences. Nonetheless, the trend is the same across all three approaches. People with multiple episodes fare much worse than people who respond well to an intervention for first episode psychosis. While it has long been recognized that relapse increases the risk of subsequent relapse, something appears to have changed. It is reasonable to speculate that this might be due to changed priorities in mental health policy since the end of the era of deinstitutionalization. High-income countries have made huge efforts to improve outcomes from first episodes. There has been substantial investment in specialist early psychosis services, which contrasts starkly with disinvestment, loss of research interest, and some would say neglect of rehabilitation and other services for people with multi-episode psychosis. So again, so long as we keep repeating narratives that don't map onto reality, we are not forced to take stock of what is and isn't happening and make change that would address the problems. So that's why in talks I always emphasize this. It doesn't actually serve anyone's interests to keep repeating this kind of much more optimistic story of everything's constantly improving and getting better. The amount of political power that people with long-term SMI have is almost non-existent, right? This is one of the most politically disenfranchised groups in the United States, where you see to some degree effective advocacy is typically from the family side, and folks some years ago, friends of mine who were kind of trying to dig into what this looks like in terms of lobbyists in DC for the entire sector. This wasn't even separating out family, because actually the only lobbyists in DC are basically NAMI, Mental Health America, the large national orgs that have the kind of funding that they can have in DC lobbyists. That is so radically dwarfed by any area of cancer, any other chronic disease. I mean, by an exponential margin, right? So there's very little political power in this space, and that is really concerning, because the policy changes that we need made, it is really, really difficult when there is so much invisibility, right? Invisibility of the larger community, and I include, family members, people with lived experience, as well as providers who work in this space who are themselves, and I'll get to this kind of workforce point, kind of an ever diminishing and less empowered group even within their own professional associations. So here is the workforce slide, and some of us were having conversations about this last night. I was last year at a National Academy of Sciences. They had a special workshop in DC on the behavioral health workforce crisis. And the statistics we saw on the number of psychiatrists wholly leaving, not just the public sector, but all insured care, meaning the proportion of psychiatrists who only accept direct full pay out of pocket, was staggering. My mind was blown. So it goes even just beyond flight from the public sector. When it comes to clinical psychology, the crisis has gotten so bad that, as some of you probably know, the American Psychological Association are really fierce advocates for SMI, pushed for a task force to try to address this just mass sort of depletion of capacity, training capacity, and even faculty in clinical psych programs, even able to supervise or train, students, trainees who want to focus on SMI or psychosis and schizophrenia specifically. So it really is a crisis at that level, right? MDs and PhDs. Then you might think that things would be better in kind of counseling and social work. And when I moved, because I'm a psychologist, but I moved into a school of social work, I think in retrospect, naively assumed that things would be better in social work, and they're not. I would say the level of disinterest in SMI and the level of disinterest in public sector work exceeds even what I saw in clinical psychology. In our very large Western Pennsylvania MSW program, there is almost not a single student that one can find who is actually actively interested in working in SMI services. And public sector pay is one of the problems that compounds this, right? So people's incomes are likely to almost immediately triple or quadruple if they move from public sector to private sector. In California, back when I worked for an agency in California, notoriously, if our social workers went from our agency public sector programs to Kaiser Permanente, quadrupling in salary overnight. And so most folks cannot make that work, especially in high cost, urban areas and cities. And then some new developments that are likely to compound these existing crises are now the new student loan caps, which are both lifetime and graduate student caps. And in my School of Social Work, we've already done the calculations, and a substantial number of students will now no longer qualify for full federal financial aid, meaning to get a social work degree, they would have to take out private loans. This hasn't happened yet, right? Because these rules kick in this summer. And so students starting in the fall will be the first cohort to face the new rules. almost certainly we would be naive to think that the result of this will not be a significant reduction in the number of people pursuing social work degrees. And at the same time, although the rules here, it's not exactly clear how they're going to be operationalized, but there is a big federal push to potentially sanction institutions of higher education where the return on investment for the degree is really low. Well, you are guaranteed to get low return on investment if you're placing students in the public sector, because yes, these are some of the lowest paid jobs out there. And we are extremely worried about what this is going to mean for a discipline like social work. The same would, of course, apply to counseling. I know like a lot of the, nursing advocacy groups are also very, very worried about different, kind of different nursing streams. So, one thing I want to say is there's sort of a way in which these different issues concatenate, right? When you see disinvestment playing out across multiple spaces, those forms of disinvestment start to support each other. If you're going into a social work program and the prevailing sentiment of everyone seems to be, this is not important, or this is horrible low-paid work, this is not where the exciting innovation is at, and that is compounded by pay, and that is compounded by prevailing societal attitudes. These are all gonna, kind of cumulatively have an impact much larger than any one of those things happening in isolation. Then there is a problem of the fact that we tend to include in spaces that are claiming lived experience involvement or aimed at lived experience involvement those who look and act like us. Like I would often describe this as who look normal in spite of technically having a diagnosis. I 100% fall in this category, right? And the problem there, when this becomes a systemic tendency, it's not isolated cases where this happens, is that we are often not engaging in the same way with folks who are experiencing really significant levels of disability. And I'm not even sure that we are, in a direct sense, contributing to breaking the stigma, because if the referent becomes, yes, this nicely dressed, well-spoken person with a, master's degree or beyond, they're not threatening to me. But then if you go out onto the subway and you see someone disheveled who hasn't been able to, take a shower or wash in weeks or months or even years, who's muttering to themselves, do you now think, well, the right kind of people with a diagnosis are okay, but this still very much scares me. And maybe this scares me even more because why can't they just be like the other professional person I met with the diagnosis? So I think this isn't really kind of studied to the extent that it should be documented, but I have a lot of concerns that the way I'm treated in spaces I enter into is absolutely not how a lot of the folks that I work with are treated if they would enter into the same spaces. And how that leads to bias in terms of planning and policy is inevitably then whose priorities are being represented, what complications, right? Because if you are navigating all of this truly in absolute poverty, the priorities are going to look different from somebody, for example, who has lots of financial resources. It's going to look different. The priorities are going to be different. And, again, the problem of systematic exclusion is how that starts to affect things at multiple levels. It happens in research and evaluation spaces, in policy and planning, and so on. different kind of, not wholly unrelated, but a different kind of problem is confirmation bias. The version of confirmation bias that plays out in this space, I would say, is that most of us, most of the time, are talking to people who think like us, who agree with us. We prefer conversations that are confirmatory. And that's just true probably of society, of human beings in general. In this space, it becomes really problematic because I would argue that there are no one-size-fits-all solutions for anything we're talking about. The level of complexity, the level of individual difference defies anything that would have these kind of simple, black box type solutions. But that really means that we have to engage very deeply with people who maybe have a different perspective, disagree with us, and or they're not benefiting from something we love. We were trained, we were maybe even the developer of the intervention, or we've spent the last 15 years implementing it. Are we actively seeking out individuals who are not benefiting from whatever that is and trying to learn why, right? What are the mechanisms whereby somebody is not benefiting, somebody is harmed? Progress, movement, change, transformation, they actually depend on this unsettling, on challenges, right? If everybody just thinks the same way and agrees, you just keep doing things the same way. Progress depends on being challenged. And I really like the sort of the metaphor of unsettling, right? We get all kind of comfortable and stuck, and something needs to shake that up. But when we only have people who agree with us in the room, that tends not to happen. So part two, which is really just kind of the reverse of each of these points, starting with this unsettling, right? We are successful. We have put together, in fact, a successful advisory board, advisory function, multi-stakeholder meeting. If we leave that space challenged, uncomfortable, right? We would be dishonest for the most part if being challenged didn't make us uncomfortable. Discomfort is actually a good thing, right? That is part of change, right? It's part of change that we're uncomfortable. We're pushed to think differently. We're pushed to imagine things that we didn't come into that room thinking about because somebody different from us has said, hey, this other thing matters. This is a problem that you're not seeing as a problem. So this, what I'm calling here, complicating engagement that challenges us to think and be otherwise, to do things differently than we have, that is essential. And if we could embrace that as a principle, I think that would be enormously, potentially truly transformative. Moving past one-size-fits-all solutions, in a sense, you're comfortable with the confirmatory bias if you think there's just one thing that helps people, this helps people, we should give it to everyone, or, provide this intervention to everyone. I, from wearing my research hat, find that wildly at odds with the reality of how people respond to any intervention under the sun that you can name, even including interventions that we sometimes think of as benign, like different forms of psychotherapy. They can have real harms too in really complicated ways. They can completely fall flat. There are people for whom that type of relational engagement is the antithesis of anything that feels helpful, right? A lot of service users I've talked to who the last thing they want to do is sit in a room and talk about their feelings. Same thing with peer support. Not everybody wants to sit around in a group and talk about their feelings. So people are incredibly different. The level of challenges or disability they're up against is different in even more granular ways. Are you hearing voices or, experiences of psychosis that are more kind of organized around feelings of paranoia, feeling that you're under surveillance. Those actually can be really different experiences. So people are incredibly different, and the contexts that they're living in are, even more different in some sense. Whether that is you go from one county to another, right, anywhere in the United States, and you can have a completely differently configured mental health system. You have different laws and statutes, just a patchwork of kind of difference, not to mention things like the neighborhood that you're in. Is it a neighborhood? When I was in graduate school in Chicago, working with folks in the public mental health system there, folks that I would work with on the South Side who were literally afraid to go out of their house because they could be shot, or their apartment, and who would sometimes tell me, well, like, the positive thing about my voices is that they can accurately predict whether it's even safe for me to walk out and go to the corner store or not. That is a completely different life experience of life than somebody who's in a crime-free neighborhood where the last thing they're thinking about is whether it's even safe to walk, literally safe to even walk out of their doorstep. So thinking that we can come up with these kind of cookie cutter interventions, we test them in an RCT, this is now what people get, I think is something that fundamentally has to be rethought. And why this has to do with lived experience is we can't know that and understand that unless we deeply listen to people in all their difference, in all their kind of heterogeneous, everything about their lives and experiences, and deeply think about how we can tailor services truly to individuals with very, very different kinds of values, needs, and just levels of challenge. Foregrounding perspectives that are not at the table. Again, as I mentioned before, I've done a lot of work in the early psychosis space. Over and over, what I see happen in whether it's policy, practice, or research is the early psychosis success stories. And for a long time, that was me. Everybody would love to invite me to give talks because you're the paragon success story for early intervention. Research that I've been involved in recently, looking at now national EpiNet data. So this is the largest data set of early psychosis, or of clients in early psychosis services that exists anywhere in the world. What we actually see is that only 30% of them even complete the indicated period of early psychosis treatment. Rates of disengagement, dropout are staggeringly high. It's actually the majority of clients, however we want to understand this, vote with their feet or other kinds of adverse outcomes, right? They end up in jail or prison. Sometimes it's certainly moving state lines. So who do we need to be going to? We need to go to those who are disengaging and ask them why. And that seems like a very simple thing. And believe it or not, as somebody who's intimately involved in this space, I have been making the case for just that for years without seeing anybody, actually kind of take up that direction. Very recently, including within my own EpiNet hub, that's some of the work that we're focusing on. Why is that where we need to go? We need to, if it works for someone, that is absolutely wonderful. Whatever the intervention is, that's great. Where we have then to grow, to change, to transform, to improve is where it's not working. And the way that we can really deeply understand why it's not working is to go to the people for whom it's not working. And I think there's, various ways that this can play out. I think we need more creativity, and I know I'm almost at time. I really want to emphasize this. We have grown into this default in the participatory space, whether we're talking about participatory policy, planning, research. I see this everywhere in all the different kind of spaces that I work across. which is a community advisory board, a partnership with an established entity, right? It could be a local NAMI chapter, it could be NAMI national, it could be MHA, it could be a peer-led national organization like the Copeland Center. And by the way, the executives of these organizations are all, by definition, very successful, accomplished people. They are not struggling with poverty, right? So those kinds of partnerships have a systemic bias. And then community advisory boards assume a lot about what people have access to, who they are, how they're able to engage. Most people I work with in the sort of the branch of my work that really focuses on long-term SMI, people who are the worst off, they often don't even have phones. I mean, seriously, when we're doing, research and data collection, we often have to pick a library near a shelter because somebody doesn't even have a non-smartphone, much less a computer to be joining what are increasingly Zoom-based advisory board meetings. And hiring people, same problems, right? You're not even going to get, I've tried this, right? Even hiring people who have criminal records, broken, kind of trajectories in terms of employment in a more extreme way, have been maybe fired by multiple past employers. You can't even get them past HR. So I think that what we need to do is think about different kinds of ways that we can hear from a much more diverse group of people. Some of that is going to be observation. Some of the interviews that I've done for an assisted outpatient treatment evaluation in New York that I'm doing that have been the most heartbreaking have been the parents. And it's been parents, and this isn't even really specifically tied to AOT, it's parents saying, all there is for my child is this group home in a service ghetto. There's no park you can walk to. They don't do any activities. Nobody takes them out of the group home. My daughter, my son is stuck like a vegetable. This is the kind of language that incredibly distressed parents are using, and nobody cares. Right? So what do we have to do to engage those people? We would have to go to those places to meet them where they're at in that sense, right? And that's not how we have been approaching participatory methods or participatory policy. We have to be more inclusive about who we are reaching out to, making a concerted effort to listen to, right? And to, again, complicate. And sometimes it's observation. Sometimes people won't talk, and we might be in that group home, walk into the bathroom and realize that you have to walk through 6 inches of standing water, see that there is no privacy available to anyone, stay there for a day, a week, and realize nobody comes to take them out into the community. There are no activities. There is no social inclusion. We have to see it to document that this is not what we want. Even if in quantitative data, it looks like hospitalizations are reduced. That is still not a life. And we have to, again, get a lot more creative in how we understand what is really happening. And I know Lucky says I'm out of time. Okay, so I'll just end there. So again, Fred, in a very courageous way, because again, I just want to repeat how much kind of controversy, how hard it is to actually work in this space as somebody with lived experience who is, shifting across very different stakeholders and constituencies, trying to make change happen, and in some cases just constantly judged for doing that. Right? But I think Fred was very clear-eyed about what the goal was, and so he could overlook a lot of really difficult stuff that I'm sure he had to experience because the goal was clear that there are people who are so disenfranchised and it is not acceptable, and we need to fight for that. So our task is just to keep up that fight, to really keep up that fight where the focus is not getting people out of the way of homeowners who don't want a housing encampment a block from their house or are now afraid to ride on the subway. It has to be about meaningful lives, restoring people to meaningful lives in a real way, and to get more creative about how we do this, to recognize that kind of some of the ruts we have fallen into are not working and we need to change, and we need people in the room who remind us that we need to change, and we need to reach out into the community, go to the spaces that people are at who can't get to the proverbial table, and ask them what needs to change. All right, thank you guys. I'm sorry I'm a little late.